Awesome. Well, to see so many people here already, that's great. And now I'm on video, and hopefully you all can hear me. Let me know in the chat window if you can. This inaugural webinar. It feels like, so focused on putting this together for the last few weeks. It's so great to have it finally come together. Maybe we'll give it a few minutes because we're 2 minutes from 3. But maybe while we're waiting, we can, in the chat window, just have people tell us where you're logging in from today. I'm obviously Sarah, I'm your facilitator today, and I'm Director of Professional Development and Postdoctoral Affairs at Boston University. But who do we have in the room?
Executive Director of the MPA.
Great, hi.
So get this up and running. Thank you for leading it.
That's great. But one more minute. I just want to be also respectful of everyone's time, but at the same time, it's the first webinar, so I want everyone to feel like they've had a chance to log in and that they're not coming in and missing part of it. Maybe started. All of you are clearly logged in some way, shape, or form because you've connected with the NPA, which is awesome. But I'd like to take just a few minutes while we're waiting for a few more people to join, just to remember that the NPA has a lot of other resources on the website and via social media beyond just this webinar series. And so if this is your first dabble into the NPA, I would encourage you to follow up, set up a profile on the website, and take advantage of all of the different toolkits and resources that exist there. I feel passionate about those because I am co-chair of the NPA's Resource Development Committee, and it's really our mission to provide resources that serve the postdoc community at large, and that, of course, includes all of you. And kudos to the NPA staff, Julie and Amy, and others who really felt like having a webinar for postdocs was a great resource to have, because it was really their partnership that enabled this series to get started and the committee to move forward with it. And so certainly, we hope you like what you see today and in the webinars in the coming year, but if there are other ways that we can provide resources for you, don't hesitate to reach out to us and let us know, how the NPA can better provide support. And I usually put it on the opening slide, but today I forgot to put my email, so I've put it into the chat window. Whether you have questions about interviewing or getting involved in the NPA, I'm happy to have you reach out after this webinar is over to get more details. So with that, it's 2:03, and so I think I'll get started. So hopefully you all are here because you want to learn more about interviewing. And, I picked to do this, interestingly enough, because when I interviewed for my position was in the NPA, several panelists said, well, You did a good job, and I think the reason why I was able to succeed in that interview is in part because I had spent a lot of my time out of academia in government, where I was involved in a lot of interview panels from the other side. And I think seeing how people were being evaluated changed the way that I approached the interview situation when I myself was being evaluated. And so, hoping that through this webinar I can share, some of those things with you today. There are ways that we can interact. I saw some of you testing your video. That's great. Obviously, you can speak up at any time. I know this is a webinar, and so then how we can interact. But do feel free to interrupt with questions if something doesn't make sense. I have several polls, so feel free to provide answers or type into the chat window what you're thinking. The goal is that as a community, we can kind of discuss this topic together. So, and so there'll be a focus on the STAR method, and I'll tell you a little bit about that as the talk goes on, and maybe some of you have heard that acronym before. So we have a very, kind of set of goals for this session, and the first is just to make you feel like you are increasing your preparation for when you have a job interview, and because of that, hopefully you feel more confident going into it. You feel like you know what you can expect. At the same time, interviews are really stressful. I think meeting strangers is stressful in general for many of us, and so I hope that through that preparation and that confidence and beginning to be proactive about the interview process, that your uncertainty and stress and anxiety about interviewing will decrease. I think that's a bigger lift, because even now I still get nervous for interviews, but my hope is that we will at least begin to increase your preparation and confidence and maybe start to lower that uncertainty a bit. So what are we going to cover today? I'll talk a little bit about social presence in different interview settings. I think that's something that gets overlooked. Social presence can be a game changer in terms of the impression that you make, and so we'll talk a little bit about what that means and how you can do that. Of course, we'll cover types of interview formats and maybe some example questions that you get asked. I'm sure that's the primary reason that you all are here. And we'll cover the STAR method, which is really a storytelling method to be able to give concise answers in an interview format, so that your nerves don't get the best of you and you're kind of rambling all over the place. So what we're able to do or be able to think about doing is identifying strategies to create connections with your interviewer. I hope you'll be able to recognize the different categories of interview questions, because I think if you know what type of question you're being asked, that can help you tailor your response. And finally, we'll practice applying the STAR method so that you can come up with, like I said, some concise answers to be able to be more effective. Move forward. Does anyone have any questions about what we'll cover? Or also in the chat window, feel free to type questions as you go along, or other things that I may miss that you want to make sure you learn today. Awesome, and I don't hear any questions, so I'm going to move forward. And one thing that I should say is, in online space, one way that you can create social presence is just by leaving a little bit more of a pause than you would in person. I can't see all of you, and some of you might type faster than others. So at points, you may see me pause for responses a little longer than I would if we were all in the room together. And that's just to make sure that I give you the opportunity to participate. So, prepping for an interview. So, I thought we could talk a little bit about what I've already looked for in reviewing your CV and cover letter, so that you have a sense of what the mentality is in bringing you in. And there's the nuts and bolts, what are the different types of interviews. And, we can go over a checklist of things that you can do to feel more prepared when you actually interview. So I'm Types of skills or behaviors or attitudes do organizations look for, when they're bringing people in for an interview? What do you think they are looking at your CV and cover letter and trying to bring out? Just take a moment, talk on the mic, or put it into the chat window. I'll be quiet for just a minute or two just to hear your thoughts. And don't be shy, but what do you think? So initiative. What else? Soft skills. Oh, that's teamwork, people person. And just a note about the chat window, make sure you check your send to box. One of the comments was sent to me privately, so just make sure you send it to everyone unless you really want to send me a note. I love this one, enthusiastic about the subject and keen to learn. I think passion is so important, and the cover letter is a really great opportunity to provide that, and that's one of the things I often talk about with my postdocs. Do you have any other ideas about what types of skills or behaviors or attitudes they might be looking for to bring you in? Independence, that's key. You all are postdocs, which means they want to see that you're transitioning into that independent state. Great ideas. And so really viewing job competencies. I know from my recruiting experience, I used to sort these into 4 buckets. So one is around outcomes. That's the most important thing to a lot of employers. And to some extent, that's not necessarily industry driven. When I say that, I even mean in academia. What do you want this person to accomplish in this job? So in academia, we think about the kind of typical productivity measures of grants and papers and patents, and but in industry, it could be project completion, or it could be teamwork. There are a number of different outcomes that different positions might have. As an administrator, the outcomes for my job might be very different. But if looking at my CV or my resume, they're looking to see, does this person have experience actually doing what they could, what we expect them to do in this job? What are job goals? I think if you don't have direct experience because you're just entering out of postdoc and maybe transitioning into a new sector, then looking for evidence in the skills bucket. What's the knowledge must a person have to achieve the outcomes? So if you don't have demonstrated outcomes, it might not be a deal breaker for an entry-level position, but they do at least want to see that you have the qualifications that could lead to those outcomes. And so skills can sometimes be a proxy for outcomes. Along those lines, what experience is necessary, whether it be educational experience, again, kind of situational experience, the type of work environments you've had. And it's a difference. So, pay extra attention to the experience that's necessary versus experience that's helpful but not absolutely necessary. A lot of job posts differentiate between the two, and you should prioritize the way you list your qualifications to make sure that they know you have everything necessary. But also don't forget to highlight those things that you might have that aren't, absolutely necessary. But finally, many of you mentioned this in the chat window. I would put a lot of the comments that you made in the category of organizational alignment. People thinking about, where does this job sit in our company, in our organization, in our institution? What's the environment of that position? And what personal characteristics do we want in this person? And, how does their cover letter and their job experience to date convey that? And a question from Andrew, in the case of a job transition, should outcomes be focused on those relevant to the job description for which you are applying? So I think that transition's interesting. And again, I think if you don't have those specific outcomes. So if you've ever worked in industry before, you might not have specific outcomes that are relevant to the position. If you've never been a medical liaison, then, you might not, a postdoc, be able to directly translate your day-to-day. And so what you need to sell is the tool set, again, the skills, that you and directly tie it to outcomes. So, I see that this position requires me to be able to generate reports, for a specific disease audience. In my role as a postdoc, I put together infographics to advertise the mission of the NPA in Andrew's case, or something that enables that you're able to take a set of knowledge in that particular example that's specific to a group of experts and train it out so that other people can understand it. That's a skill that's required in a medical science liaison role. And although you don't have that direct outcome, you have an outcome and you have the skills that translate. And so I think that's the difference in the transition between outcomes and skills, is that you just want to be able to sell them that you can perform this job in an outcomes-based way, even if you haven't necessarily gotten those outcomes yet. That makes sense to you, Andrew, but feel free to follow up in the chat window. Those are the things that they're looking for in your cover letter. And I think it's good to have that reference point. If they're bringing you in, they've already seen enough across these 4 areas that they have evidence that you could do this job based on these different criteria. And so really, they have 2 goals. One is just the bound against that actual job description. Again, it's those required of experiences and qualifications that I talked about. And if possible, they are really trying to get the impression of transferable skills, your personality, and to some extent, again, alignment with their institution or organization. They don't, sometimes that can be harder to get depending on the type of position that you're applying for. Ultimately, that's how they're trying to navigate the recruitment process to narrow the field. And this scenario, congratulations. All have made it through, that successful review process. And so, now, really looking to prepare for the interview. And so there are a lot of different types of interviews these days in terms of what you could be asked to do in order to kind of demonstrate your potential for the position. So the thing that can vary is just who is interviewing you. So you could have a one-on-one interview, and that could be a series of one-on-ones or just one one-on-one meeting. You could meet with a group or a panel, a set of people all at the same time. The format can vary in terms of you could be asked to have a phone interview, you could be asked to do a video conference interview, you could be brought in person for an actual visit, and the style can vary too. So places do a series of interviews where they might vary the format. So, obviously it's probably no surprise to you that often a phone interview precedes, for example, an in-person interview. But once you're there, you could have question and answer, which is what we'll spend a lot of time thinking about today. Or you could actually have a skills application. A lot of consulting firms, for example, will actually give you team-based case studies that you need to solve as part of the interview process. And so it may not just be your narrative. You may actually be able to have the opportunity to demonstrate those skills in the interview setting. And although this is really much less common these days, you may occasionally have the actual group interview. And again, this is specific to the consulting example, but one of my postdocs actually went on an interview where they were interviewing with other candidates simultaneously. So don't hesitate to clarify when you're asked for an interview, what type of format it is, who will be in the room, and even the style. Will I be expected to demonstrate my skills? Will I need to prepare a talk? Often they'll provide all of this information for you, but it's just helpful to keep this as a frame of mind and make sure that you're absolutely clear as to what you need to prepare. With that in mind, given that context, I'm going to pull it back to all of you. What types of things are you thinking about? So you're probably all here because you're thinking of going on the job market, what do you think you need to prepare ahead of time before you go on an interview? What are the types of things that you have to think about? Organization, do your homework. Answers, yes. It's very comprehensive. Lots of things on the checklist. Researching colleagues, mission of the organization, work culture. If you're required to do that, absolutely. Ginny's point is very important, and we'll talk about that at the end of my talk today. Sensible questions to ask. That's a really important one. Thanks, guys. Feedback. So, checklist here. One I think can get overlooked is make sure before you go in that you take a look at that job application and spend some time drawing a map. Again, around outcomes, skills, experience, and attainment. Pick it apart. Be able to take each piece of that job description and be able to tie that back to something that you have, that you bring to the table. And creating that map might be around self-assessment. So everyone's prepared to talk about their strengths. But I always found really impressive about the candidates that I met with is that they genuinely had a sense of where they could develop. And I use the word develop rather than improve or weaknesses because I think we all have areas for growth. And particularly if someone is investing time into hiring you, they want that investment to grow over time. And so being able to identify your growth areas is a huge part of what they will do when you come on board. And so if you're reflective enough to know where those spaces are, that can play into the types of questions you might ask them. And so you can be about your real areas for development and not falling back on the common strategy of like, oh, my weakness is that I work too hard. You know, that doesn't really tell me anything about you, and it also doesn't help me envision your longevity in my organization. So strengths are really important, and you should put your best face forward. And you certainly want to be selective about the types of areas for development that you reveal. But it is important to have them and be able to talk about them because you will get asked. It's also helpful to contact your references. Depending on the sector they're in, they reach out to them fairly quickly, and so it's just good to give them a heads up. I know that when we interviewed at the consulate, where I worked prior to running the postdoc office, if we really liked a candidate, I might call their references that afternoon, because if I know that they're the right person for the job, I want to move as quickly as possible. And so giving a heads up that you have the interview is always a good idea because they will be prepared for that phone call. Identify appropriate attire. I just have to say that only because you would be surprised at some of the things that people wore to the British consulate interviewing for science policy positions. Some comes down to knowing the organization. You know, if you're interviewing at a startup, a three-piece suit is probably not the way to go. But, you know, if you're interviewing in the government, you know, jeans and a blazer probably also isn't the way to go. And so, you know, to some extent, that's around understanding the place that you're going. But if it's over a bit, you take it up a notch. Someone said in chat window, practice interview questions. We're going to do that today, but you know, it's also important to do. And that relates to preparing a job talk or anything else that they've asked you to prepare ahead of time, and making sure that you practice it in front of a lot of different people. I think sometimes one for postdocs is to find groups of people that aren't in your discipline to hear your job talk. And I would encourage you to do that, whether it's Skyping with your family or with another friend. You've never been in the room, and you may have people who aren't discipline experts watching your talk, and you just want to make sure that you are being clear enough that they can follow you, even if they don't necessarily understand the research that you've done. Maybe research the place that you're going, if you're interviewing in person, or if you're not. make sure you identify a good location if you're on the phone or video. Hey, I'm in a quiet office. My office-mate who usually sits behind me is somewhere else. And I did that because I have the webinar with all of you. Again, I can't tell you the number of times where I've had a phone interview or a video interview where, someone is in Starbucks or a crowded, where we were interviewing a candidate for the co-chair. I think it was a car mechanic, and completely understand the need for work-life balance. But, if your potential job is on the line, just wherever possible, try to prioritize a quiet place where you can be by yourself. And, prepared to describe the company mission. Again, I've actually been surprised the number of places where I've interviewed people and we say, what's your view of the British Consulate? What are we here to do? Or what is the mission of the NPA? And those things are clearly stated on the website, and yet candidates can't produce that information. If in academia, that question might come up in terms of, what do you think are the strengths of this department? Or what is the mission of this graduate program from your perspective, and where do you think it could go? Just be able to be familiar enough with what they're doing that you can describe those things. And when possible, again, tie it back to you. How does that align with your values? What types of things do you value in being part of an organization? How can you create that connection right from the start? And if possible, research who's interviewing you. Sometimes you'll get a list of people that you're meeting with, and sometimes you won't. If you do, it's helpful. Who are they? What's their background? Again, that will help you prepare answers. If you know that you're in a room with a bunch of discipline-specific people, then you can really dive in and demonstrate your technical knowledge. But if you know that you're in a diverse room with a lot of different types of people, then that might change the examples that you give. So when possible, know who's across the table from you. Before we talk about the actual interview itself, I'm just going to pause there. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we move on to the next phase? I just want to make sure everyone's still with me. Well, now talk about going on the interview. And so there are kind of three parts to that. The first is around creating social presence. The second thing is know what types of questions you might be asked. Third is basically, again, applying the storytelling method to actually developing concise answers. Because social presence is something that comes up a lot in the teaching learning literature. But it wasn't necessarily something that crossed my radar until I started working in a postdoc office. Does any social presence means or want to take a step at what I mean when I say social presence? Again, you can know, or feel free to test out your mic. Yeah, like I said, I hadn't come across this before I started working for a postdoc office and interacting with a lot of faculty that were kind of deep into the teaching and learning space. But it's really valuable. Jessica, how people will perceive you. So the definition is the degree to which a person is perceived as real in a mediated communication. And a more recent definition is a continuum, a focus on interpersonal emotional connection between communicators on one end, and also if someone is perceived as being present, there, or real at the other end. And so there are common things around these definitions, and the two words that jump out are perception, which Jessica spoke to in her chat, and the word real. People want to feel that you're being genuine, and that creates the best impression. And so there are a lot of different strategies that we take to try to make sure that we are conveying our genuine self and creating that perception. And so we'll just talk about a few of those. But the size is that, I love PhD comics. It's sort of like one of my favorite cartoons. And what I like about this cartoon is that, last thought bubble of I read it on the internet. He got that to himself. So, you should never misrepresent yourself. There is something about being too real and too honest, right? He simply said that's PhD training, which is sort of funny because it was, clearly something that, he had prepared for ahead of time. So the precision of being real and being real, it's a fine line in terms of you want them to believe you, and you want to create that truth and trust between you and the people across the table. But you probably don't have to reveal every card in your hand and show them every level of preparation that you've done in order to get to this space. So it's a balance. I'm not saying that you have to lay it completely all on the table, but it's just to say that if they feel like you're not being genuine or real, it will limit their ability to trust the decision to hire you. And so strategies that you can use in everyday conversation to build social presence with other people. And these are strategies that you do all the time with your friends and your coworkers that you probably don't even think about. And in the interview, you can be strategic. You can display emotion, not the kind of angry kind or the crying kind or the dramatic kind, but you can be really excited and passionate. And in fact, people really respond well to that. You can use humor to a certain extent to lighten the mood. You have to be a little careful about that in terms of your audience, but there's one approach. Paralanguage works better when you're on Skype or other forms of electronic communication. So paralanguage are things like emoticons and, kind of nonverbal, communication. A way that you can establish social presence in the literature. I'm not sure I would necessarily go the emoticon on the interview, but it is important. But really important on the effective side. Disclosure. So again, them, and this comes back to being reflective, you want them to feel like you've really thought about this position and its fit, and you have determined that you really are the best candidate for this job, and that you are disclosing and being real about the things that make you qualified, and that you are providing not rehearsed answers, stock answers, but kind of genuine responses. There are also little subtle things you can do. Just make sure you greet everyone. Hello, how are you today when they walk in the room? Referring to people by name, that's a great question, Marta. Making references to them as a group. I know all of you working in the company, subscribe to this mission, or, ways to kind of draw them in as a whole. You seem to be asking me about questions related to teamwork. I'm really interested in my opportunities related to leading teams. As an example of a question you could ask them. There's also kind of the social sharing piece, which of course happens in, groups of friends. We're all kind of sharing things, and it's a little harder to draw out of interviews. But you can, again, in the questions piece, where you could simply say, Jim told me about a particular project in his group. Jessica, I'm wondering if you could tell me about a project in yours. In kind of getting them to feel like they're all being drawn into the conversation that they're having with you. Another way to establish social presence with someone is to offer them a resource. And so in this case, that's really connecting, again, what you're able to do to provide outcomes for them. Finally, I think in conversation, there are little things you can do, to make sure that they know that you're interacting and listening to them. You can acknowledge their point or repeat it back to them. You can agree or disagree. You can take a position on what they've said to you, obviously in a respectful way if you disagree. And really, inquiry. I think the inquiry part of interviews is really an important piece because it demonstrates engagement, and that as time has gone on in the interaction, it's affected you in some way and you've processed it and come up with a set of questions. And so, these are all ways that you build trust every day with people but they are habits that you can get into practicing in order to make getting to know strangers easier. And so there are strategies that you can think about in terms of your interview. And that phone and video conferencing, it's really hard. It's really hard when you're not in person because there's almost always some sort of technical issue. I'm sort of waiting for the shoe to drop on this webinar. And you can plan and plan, but sometimes, you know, the internet connection on their end goes out or your cell phone just drops the call. And so, you know, just plan for that. Be, you know, on your end, resolve it quickly or contact them. If it's on their end, just be patient. Don't show that you're frustrated. You know, don't make weird jokes about it. And I think just plan on, if for some reason they're having trouble hearing you or you're having trouble hearing them, just speak more slowly, perhaps more loudly, articulate your words, and just get through it. You know, but I think the more you can prepare yourself mentally for that possibility, the less stressful it will be. Because if your expectation is for a technical issue, then if it doesn't happen, it'll just be kind of in a relaxed state. And to keep in mind is that, you know, one thing that really helps us connect with other people are the physical cues. You know, if I'm in a classroom, I'm looking for eye contact. I'm looking for what people's body language is. Are they slumped in their seat? Have they fallen asleep? Are they whispering to a neighbor? Are they already looking at their phone? You know, in an interview, it's things like shuffling papers or eye contact that they might make with a panelist, or you know, subtle physical cues. Just smiling might be more difficult to see on video, and you certainly can't see them smile on the phone. You know, you won't get that feedback, and that means they also won't get it from you. And so you have to try that much harder to convey what it is that you're trying to say through other means. And so this is where, you know, the art of active listening is very important, because it's very easy to miss something that someone says on the phone or in video, because it's more likely that you'll get distracted because they're not right there in front of you, keeping your focus. In terms of how you can present yourself, you know, you have to rely on tone of voice. I interviewed my first phone interview. You know, I tried to think of, like, who is the persona on the other end? Like, who am I trying to talk to? And you want it to seem like you're really familiar with that person and that your tone of voice is enthusiastic. And, you know, I'm just telling you about my job and how it's going. You're very relaxed. And I think that's something that you have to practice with something that you know really well. It's all about precise word choices. Again, you don't have that physical means to always maintain eye contact with the person, which means talking, if you start to drift off into a kind of rambling space, they totally tune out, and it might be harder to bring them back in because you can't kind of make that eye contact with them. And so practicing your answers for phone interviews so that they're more precise is another way to make sure that you're using the best of their time, but also that you're eliminating the possibility that their mind might wander somewhere while you're talking. That I've alluded to earlier in terms of this webinar, but I think that holds true in any phone or video context is wait longer than you normally would for their conversation to kick in if you've spoken, and vice versa. You know, there could be a lag, or they might have had trouble hearing you and they're kind of replaying it back in their mind. And so it's not common for there to be a brief space of uncomfortable silence that in person would be strange, but in this format is just a product of the technology. And so before you interject and kind of rush it, you know, just wait that 1 second longer, or just make sure that it's, again, not a lag on their end, because you don't want to be perceived as talking over them. And so that's one way also to, you know, keep the pace such that you have time to think about things between questions. So it's so these are some extra strategies in very hard formats, and we can talk about that at the end too, because I would say when postdocs come to see me for interview advice, it's usually on these types of interviews, you know, where they can't see the other person, or even if they can, they're not in the same room. You know, what factors limit your social presence? I mean, let's be realistic about this. It's a power structure. They job, you want that job. So that's part of it, absolutely. And that can make you really nervous. It can cause you a lot of emotional stress. And so you can become harder to remember to say their name or to repeat back what they said, because you're just in your head feeling stressed out. Maybe you didn't like the answer you gave to that previous question. Sometimes physical stress. Maybe you stayed up all night the night before reading their paper before you met with the particular faculty member. Maybe the opposite. Maybe, you're like me and you had to go to a job interview once where your twins were up all night and you had no chance to really prepare what you were going to say mentally, and you did on the drive there. Maybe you're not connecting with them, or you have other things going on in your world where your mind just jumps for a second. And then, like I mentioned, on the phone and video, there can be this lack of awareness of the audience because you can't necessarily see their cues or their body language. Or the opposite. They can see their body language, or you can see their body language, and it's changing your perception of how the conversation is going. And one of the reasons why I'm emphasizing being deliberate about social presence is that in ways it's a way of keeping your head down. And so even if you have these challenging moments in an interview, you don't like the answers to the last question, you've noticed that one of them is clicking their pen the whole time and it's driving you crazy, or one of them scribbling notes and you don't know what they're writing, whatever the case may be. Instead of pressing the reset button, you can kind of use social presence as a framework and a structure for keeping you calm and for keeping the pace going and for deliberately trying to make that connection. And I definitely think that, it's something that we do every day, all the time with the people we're close to, but it can be an intentional framework that you build into your interviews. And it's certainly rely on. So that goes over a little bit about connecting with the person that's asking you questions. Different types of questions that people ask you in interviews. And you may not have ever thought about sorting them into buckets, but in some sense, into buckets can help you identify how to answer it in the most concise way. Some of them are chronological. Describing your background. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about education. Tell me about your training. That requires you to basically string together a series of chronological events in a way that makes sense. Some are about behavioral. Why do they do that? Well, they want to connect your past performance to how to behave and act. So tell me about a time where you responded in this way, or tell me about a time where you were presented with this challenge. What did you do? So they need to look at the tables that they can read on your CV, published 6 papers, or presented this team project, or whatever the case may be, and they want to unpack what actions and behaviors led to that outcome, because they're really looking at it as how the actions and behaviors of this person align with the organizational alignment of this place. Not that much different than behavioral, but the main difference is that it's putting your performance, your past performance, in a specific context. So in this position, you often have to host foreign ministers. Tell me about a time where you have hosted a senior level manager and how you interacted with that person. So it's still kind of behavioral. They're not necessarily expecting you've ever performed the task before, but they're providing you with the scenario that they want you to perform in so that you can make that connection. And so make sure you do, make sure you draw your experience directly to that situation. I don't know all of your backgrounds, of course, but some of you may be in very technical fields where you will be, meeting with technical experts in your field where you will be required to demonstrate your discipline-specific knowledge in some way. And that could be a talk, or that could just be the types of questions that they ask you. Some are more formal. Competency-based questions are, some companies have specific competencies where they have specific skills, knowledge, and behaviors that are required for that position. And so they have a set of questions, again, that are kind of like technical questions but that really force you to demonstrate that you have those skills, that knowledge, or those behaviors. And finally, obviously, they're looking for that alignment, that fit. How are your values and your personality going to fit into the existing team? So they ask you things like, what do you like to be managed? Or, how do you manage a challenging, how do you give challenging feedback to a coworker? Yes, of course, some of those are behavioral questions. They're still getting at behavior and actions, but they're really measuring how your personality and values in those actions tie back to their mission. So, sometimes interviews can kind of go like this, particularly when you're answering competency-based questions, where I've definitely seen people on a panel that kind of undercut interviewees, and you start to feel like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to say, I don't know what you want me to say. But I think that also can come down to the way that you construct your answer. And so, one of the reasons why I like the STAR method, which, by the way, is not mine, is that it really breaks down your answer into 3 to 4 sentences. And when you're nervous, when there are other things going on that are limiting your ability to make a good impression, have a framework to fall back on, again, as a kind of center point. And so this is really my secret to success. And like I said, I didn't come up with it. It's something that my postdoc office taught me when I was a postdoc at Cornell. About providing them with a background or context. So what's the situation that you're describing? What information do they need to know? And they don't need to know everything. You just need to give them enough that tell them what you did. It makes sense in that context. And this is really important because so many workplaces now and institutions want to understand teamwork-based skills. You have examples that focus on your role as a team, but make sure you identify what was your specific role. So if a team did something, make sure that you can identify in your example how you specifically contributed to that. And I think this is the part that I see people interviewing leave out. Construct this great situation that I completely understand, that's perfectly relevant to the question that I've asked. They'll tell me exactly what they did, and then they'll stop talking. An idea if the event that they planned had this many participants, or the participants met their learning outcomes, or what happened. And sometimes as an interviewer, I'll prompt, but you may not get an interviewer that will. So don't forget to describe end result was this. And if possible, connect it back to the outcomes that they're expecting from that question or from that job. So, you can say, and just like in this position, I'm expected to design workshops for postdocs. In my prior position, as a result, several people came to my symposium and reported, a level of satisfaction that was a 4.4 out of 5. And, I think that really demonstrates that I can put together events that are successful. Make sure, again, don't for them to draw that line. You draw that line for them through the result part of your storytelling. And sometimes it can be hard to see in the different types of questions how you can apply this method. And so I thought that I would break that down a little bit for you, except for technical questions. I mean, sometimes for technical questions, you're not going to say, and there was this one experiment that required me to run HPLC, and then I analyze. I mean, you're just going to demonstrate that you know how to analyze HPLC data. You're probably not going to set it up in this framework. So technical questions can be an exception for sure. Chronological though, think about the situation as the theme of your training. So if they say, tell me about yourself, and you're interviewing for a lab position as a biochemist, I'm a biochemist by training. The types or actions or the types of experiences you have. I did my PhD at Penn studying protein design, and my postdoc at Cornell translate that protein design into protein structure. And the results are the skills that have prepared you for this job. As a result of that, I'm an expert in genetic assays, protein crystallography, and that prepares me really well for this position in your structural biology group. Chronicle is a way that you can still take STAR and, again, avoid having a laundry list of repeating what could be a 5-page CV or a 2-page resume and typing it up. And so you can use that STAR framework to fast forward your timeline just a bit. Obviously, for behavioral, it's a little bit easier, right? It's the situation that best describes, the question that you've been asked. the specific task or role that you were assigned or that you had, the action that you directly took to address that task, and then, again, the outcomes. And that's really true, again, for the situational types of questions, competency-based questions, and to some extent the organizational alignment questions. Naming your answers so that, you can provide the context so that they get to know you, but they're concise enough that you're not taking 20 minutes to answer them. I make the point, though, may you really listen to whatever type of question that you're asked. It's so tempting to jump in that you might even get really excited about a question that you're asked, right? I mean, you're having a conversation with someone and you're going back and forth, and this happens to me a lot, so that's why I'm giving this advice. It's really important that you let them finish whatever question it is that they're asking before you pick up that football and run in whatever direction you're going with it. So even if you know of the perfect answer and you're just so excited, that interruption might not make the best impression. So just keep that in mind. And so where you guys are all watching this webinar, if we were in person, I'd have you turn to your neighbor and I would have you guys practice doing this, but we're not, we're online. So I just thought that we would take a few moments and have you pick a couple of these questions and actually take the time to write out your answers. Practice thinking about situation, task, action, and result in these contexts. So, these are very common questions that you will come across in an interview setting. All of them are necessarily reflective of what you might experience in an academic position, although the first two usually always come up. But moments and think about what it is that you would say in this framework. And so in the meantime, as you're doing a little bit of writing, if anyone has any questions about the STAR method or types of interview questions or anything I've covered to date, feel free to speak up or put in the chat window. But I really want to make sure that not only using this time for me to talk at you, but that you're actually leaving with something in hand that that you can practice later on. So just take a few minutes to do that. And I will do. It only seems fair, right? I want to leave a lot of dead time, but at the same time, like I said, I really want you guys to be able to have a few answers that you can practice, because I know when I attend webinars, I have a great experience, and then I don't think about what I've learned until I have to use it. So, and there's a question and that I have. Let's see. It wants me to answer, describe an example of when you had to provide a coworker with negative feedback. I actually got this question in a job interview, which is why I put it up here, because it actually really threw me. So when I was interviewing as a postdoc for my position at the consulate, someone asked me this question, and I really fumbled. I did. I also didn't necessarily know how I could provide the negative feedback. And so the first thing I would advise is that if you get this question, which is on a lot of standard interview question lists, if you Google interview question lists online, I'm happy to share, at BU, we actually have this manual, Hiring the Best, and a lot of these questions are also in there, and so I can send you sample questions if you want to practice. One to clarify is, can you clarify if this person is my peer or my supervisor? So the first thing is you want to understand the power dynamic behind the feedback that you are supplying. And most of the time they'll say peer, you're working on a team project, because that's really what they're trying to get at, right? How do you work on a team? And so I think what you need to do is kind of walk through the process that you use to give feedback in a generalized way. And I don't think you always have to be super specific. So what I mean by that is the following. So you can say something like, if I'm working on a team and someone is not delivering their results on time, the first thing I might think about is what other projects they have on their plate, and what are the potential reasons that they might not be completing the project on time. And if I think I know the answer to that, then I might initiate a conversation about the things that they're working on and ask if they need help. Or if I actually think that they are free to do the work, then I might ask them, how are you feeling about this project? How do you think it's going, to get at their motivation? So you can play with a couple of different scenarios, so they don't necessarily always have to pick one. I think what interviewers are looking for in this question, or at least what I never ask this question, but it does come up, and I think if I had to ask this question, what I would be looking for is not necessarily the specificity of the email, but that the person is putting a lot of thought into how that feedback is delivered, and that they also are able to flex their feedback style. So their answer should be reflective of tailoring the feedback to the environment and the individual that they're in, and not, well, my style of providing feedback is I put everything in a detailed email and I send it to the person. What tells me is that you have a pretty rigid way of working, and that you kind of hide behind your email. You could say things like, well, I would think about how that person typically communicates with me. If it seems like they like written feedback, then I might send them a short note. So I guess what I would say is that, the negative feedback question, is situation dependent. And so clarifying their context is important, and also demonstrating a flexibility and a thought process and how you communicate with people is an important skill. That goes to the extreme. So, I wouldn't say I give negative feedback all the time, and I would say, well, I never give negative feedback. I think you can also play the strength of saying, well, in situations that require feedback, undergraduate was not performing the experiment in the way in which it needed to be done, and so I needed to have a difficult conversation where I retrained them on how to do the experiment properly, versus upset when I felt marginalized in group meeting and someone dismissed my comment, but I realized that there were other ways that I could provide feedback on that project, and so it wasn't worth bringing it up with them directly. Again, you can provide whatever example you want, but again, clarifying their context is helpful, because doing so kind of drives you to what type of situation they want you to respond to. It's only fair that I share my example that I wrote out on my paper, which I redid below. So you can see I've only checked off 3 things today. That's not a good sign. So I picked the question of describe an example when you just demonstrate initiative on a project. And so what I would describe to them is that in the fall, I was the representative from my department on the Fair Labor Standards Act working group here at Boston University. And the goal of that group was to decide how affected employees would be treated in terms of whether they would be moved into hourly positions or their pay would be increased. And the specific task was figuring out what to do about researchers that weren't postdocs. So I was very clearly the postdoc representative on the working group, but the researchers at BU don't really have an office that is their home base. And so to some extent, there wasn't an active voice representing them on the committee. And so the committee felt very stuck in terms of knowing what to do. And so I stepped up and offered to look at the data and make recommendations. And so I pulled data from HR, and I also contacted other institutions to ask them how they were treating researchers in this context. I was able to put together a set of slides and make recommendations for each of the categories in the academic research job family, even though my role was only specific to postdocs. And so, that's obviously I don't have a specific position that I'm applying for, so I haven't gone the extra mile of connecting it to a job. But that's an example of how you might take a specific situation that you were involved in and put it into this framework. So on. Does anyone want to ask any other questions about these types of interview questions or others? And to share their star answer, feel free. Be shy. Tell me, how do I answer? So again, think very clearly about the position you're applying for. So this is a chronological question. And again, the situation, if you will, should be the underlying theme of the position. So if you're applying for a research-based position, then ultimately tell me about yourself, research experience in chronological order, described in a way that kind of varies to that common theme. If you're applying for a communications position or administrative position, you might choose to talk about different things. So you might choose to say, tell me about yourself. Well, you might briefly run through your education, but then you might move on to, and while I was a postdoc, I led our postdoc association, and I gained leadership experience through organizing 4 events. Or, you want to tell them about yourself in the sense that really it's your 5-minute elevator pitch as to how your qualifications match the position. So in some sense, the tell me about yourself portion of the interview should change depending on the job that you have, sort of building the chronological experience to kind of build the qualifications of that position. So, so like I said, most people rely heavily when they're coming out of postdoc on a kind of educational framework. I did my so-and-so with so-and-so, and then I did my postdoc here, and I studied X. And I would say that that's absolutely fine as a framework, but just keep in mind that if you tell them about your research experience, and again, you're applying for a position that's not actively doing research, then you've missed a trick because you really haven't told them anything about yourself that hits your qualifications. So that would be my advice to you, is just think about the position that you are applying for. What are the key things in your CV and resume that they need to know right up front to kind of hook them into believing you're the right candidate? And that's what you should tell them about yourself. Any others about these questions I've thrown up here, or any other examples? Like I said, after this webinar, I'll send Amy a kind of list of interview questions that you could use to prepare, and we can try to get it out to all of you. But I have picked dozens of questions. How to be assertive and not be passive or aggressive in this matter? Well, I think so. Here's the thing. I think this is a really important question, both for you as an interviewer and for them as a place that's hiring you. To understand the push-pull between need a job practically. Your postdoc must end at some point and you must be employed. I totally get that. And sometimes you may just need to go forward with interviews that you might not be 100% excited about. But you're in the position where you're looking for jobs actively, but you're not yet at a place where you have to settle. This question is a place where I test out being genuinely honest, because really the research shows that people leave organizations not because they're unproductive, but because they're not fulfilled. And the number one source of that unfulfillment is generally the relationship that they have with their manager or the other people that they work with, and that bleeds into basically how they approach the job. And so to some extent, work style matters, and a question that you can ask back to them. So, I was, you want a good fit and a good team. And so, in terms of preferred work style, I mean, if you're someone that generally is really independent and you've had mentoring experiences in which you are incredibly independent, then you do want to convey that, because if you were to get a boss who's incredibly micromanaging, would you stay there very long, or would you be successful? Sure. I mean, I guess that's up to you, but I would argue of all of the questions in terms of how you hold your hand and be strategic about what you say versus how open you are, this is a chance to be not aggressive but genuine. And it's all about word choice, I think, in this situation. You can say, I've had the opportunity to work in teams and I have skills in that area. I'm a very good communicator, and I'm very good at keeping track of team deadlines, but there are times where I like the creative space to work by myself on specific projects. So I would hope in this role, I would have a balance of being able to work on a team and work independently so that I can also have that creative space for myself. You can balance it so that you're still being clear about what makes you you. Because then you can follow up with, do you ever have projects that I can pursue independently? But at the same time, you're cognizant of the fact that it's an organization and you might have to pitch in on a team. So I think that's how I would balance that question. But I wouldn't be afraid to lead with who you are, because again, you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And so that's a really important piece of your workday. And as someone who has worked on teams where that hasn't always been a good fit, it can be incredibly challenging when people have different styles. Any other questions, again, about these questions or anything else? I will send Amy the kind of full list of my catalog of interview questions, and we'll try to make sure that it gets to all of you, so that if you want to pick out other things to prepare, you can certainly do that. A little bit about active listening in terms of the questions that you're being asked and not jumping in, but I want to come back to this point in terms of don't be to set expectations for how you will listen to them. So do you mind if I take notes? It's just a good thing. It's a polite thing to do. It also gives you the freedom to kind of take notes for yourself. Sometimes I've taken notes while they're asking me things so that I can prepare the star in my head so that when I talk, I've already got those bullet points lined down. I mean, they're not watching what you're writing, so but it's just good to set that expectation so that if you are going to have time being spent looking at a notebook or not looking at them, you're still conveying that you're listening. The other thing that I'm still working on, I may notice that I'm looking at the chat window and the slides on the screen. I'm trying really hard to make eye contact with that green light on my computer every so often, but it's difficult. It takes practice. Again, practice Skyping with someone and looking at the camera, because it's hard. You want to look at that person. In some ways, looking at the camera is what enables you to make eye contact. So when we're speaking, you can absolutely look at the screen, but when we're speaking, your eyes should turn to that green light. In person, you don't have to make eye contact in a sort of super creepy way, but just just make sure that you're making enough eye contact, that you're not looking down at the floor, because eye contact kind of conveys that listening in a physical way. And the phone, how you can demonstrate your listening is just that you're not shuffling, you're not making background noises, you have your Outlook so it's not pinging all the time. That can also help, make them feel like you're listening to them. One thing I'll say about active listening is typically part of active listening is repeat back what you heard. Again, that's part of creating social presence, but as I mentioned earlier, it buys you time. So if you get a tough question that you're not prepared for, like how do you provide negative feedback, by asking a clarifying question or reflecting back on what you heard from them, you're giving yourself time to let the wheels turn and come up with an answer that fits their question. It also helps set the pace. Just as much as they're asking you questions, you control the pace of the interview and how you respond. And so if you're feeling like the pace of the interview is going really rapid fire, reflecting back and kind of sitting back in your chair and asking them a question or repeating back, again, allows you to slow it down a little bit and gives you, you can formulate that response. And so now I'll wrap up because I want to make sure that we leave enough time for any other questions that I haven't covered. After the interview, so after you're done asking you lots of questions, what happens? And so in this section, I'll talk about both the inquiry, so it's your time to put them in the hot seat, and then also the follow-up, what you do directly after the interview. And you're also interviewing them. You're deciding if you want to take this job, which I think for postdocs who are just, the practical end, you must have a job, you must be employed. Sometimes that can be a little far from your view, but it really should still be front and center. So yeah, in the chat window, you guys are used to this. I see Francesca's already going at it. What do you ask? So why do you have this open position? That's an interesting question. You're trying to get at, did someone leave? Is this a new position? That's really important context to understand. That's a great question. What else? What other things would you ask me if I had, if I had an open position? What are the questions you would have prepared to ask me? Because of course you might come up with some other ones while you're in the interview. Yeah. What are the outcomes from people in this position? Were they promoted? Have they left? That's a great question. Yeah, again, I might ask you what your working style is, but you want to know what my managerial style is or mentoring style is. That's very important. And in faculty positions, I would argue this is one of the most important questions you can ask the department chair. What structures do you have formally or informally to mentor new faculty? That's key. I think so often in academia, once you enter into the assistant professor role, the notion of mentoring kind of out the window a little bit because you yourself is a mentor. But it's really important as a junior faculty to have mentors, and so it's really important that you understand that landscape. So that's a great question. What can you do future boss if I took this position? That's an interesting one. I mean, I suppose that depends on whether or not you're actually interviewing with your future boss or not. That's interesting. I might frame that slightly differently in terms of like, I met with, I met Olga earlier. Can you tell me a little bit about working with her or something? I mean, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. What the ideal candidate for this job look like? That's a good question to wrap up with because then as you close, you have the opportunity to address their answers. Growth and promotion. Yes. In what time frame are you going to let me know if I got the job or not? Absolutely. You can. I might not be able to tell you, but you should hope that they can give you some sense of when the decision will be made. Great. What are your goals for this position in the first 6 months after filling it? That's again, you want to know what you're immediately responsible for. And you want to know that because, again, you may have applied for this job because it's a good match for your skills, but their expectations might be crazy high, or the actual outputs of the position might not match up with what you're used to producing. And so, again, you have to decide right then and there, but it's something to keep in mind especially if you're weighing multiple offers. So that's a great question. An interesting one about the work environment. I think, the question gets at a really important point. You want to be able to get at how inclusive they are, and, how welcoming the environment is. This question, as you phrase it, is a little leading. It's a little leading the witness, as they say on Law and Order. I might frame it as, can you describe the work environment in your department? And follow up that description with specific questions if you think that it might not be a good fit for you. It will do this too. This is a common secret. Behaviors or competency-based questions, they're really specific. They're measuring a specific thing. We want to be able to see as interviewers that you can do something really specific. We're checking that box. But the open-ended questions provide an opportunity for us to just get unsolicited, information from you. And usually people blow those wide open, where you get so much information out of the candidate by just giving them a long enough space to kind of talk, or a broad enough space to talk. So the same thing is true for your questions for them. The more that you can use words like describe for me, that really requires them to paint a picture, and you sometimes get a lot more information than when you narrow the question. So in that case, around inclusion and kind of friendly work environment, that's the way I would approach that. Have any reservations about hiring you based on the interview? About that, I think that, I guess my response to that question, Olga, is that I would feel out the room. I know personally, when I've interviewed people and they've asked me that question, I end up hiring one of them, but I did feel a little put on the defensive. They are, in some sense, asking them to show their cards, perhaps before they finish the search. I mean, in some sense, you'd be a completely wonderful candidate, but I have two other people coming in, and so I don't necessarily want to give you a false impression when I don't know what the rest of the field looks like. So I struggled as someone interviewing other people when I got this question, and it made me feel uncomfortable. At the same time, I kind of understand the rationale. You're looking to tie up any loose ends, or making sure you're answering their questions about you as a candidate before you leave the room and you have no opportunity to do so. Again, my feedback to you would be, as an interviewer, I would much rather see someone ask me, do you have any questions for me that I haven't fully answered or that haven't addressed the skills needed for this job description? And it's something that gets at that. Again, if I have reservations about hiring you, I'm going to pick something that's on my concerned list in response to that. But it's slightly less confrontational question. So I guess that would be my advice to you if you want to play it a little conservative. And again, it didn't influence my hiring decision in the case of one candidate, but it did leave me with a super kind of, because just in this day and age, you don't want to put something out there that's positive or overly negative when the rest of the field is kind of still in play. Anyone else? Questions or things that you would prepare ahead of time? Because, like I said, obviously during the interview, you might have something that they've said that you want to follow up on, but it's good to come in with a few questions. You've asked all of your questions. Close with pitch. Thanks so much for bringing you in. I'm excited about this position because it really matches my interest in postdoc affairs, and I think my experience in science policy will really help your university grow an infrastructure for postdocs and create new policies for them. That final elevator pitch. Again, what's the theme of the job and what's the theme of your career so far, and how do those align? One sentence. Thank you so much. Boom, boom, boom. If you haven't explicitly asked it in question and answer session, definitely make sure that you understand what the next steps are. So not just what their timeline is, but are there other things that you'll be expected to do? So for example, at the consulate, we actually brought people in for an in-person interview, and then we gave them a writing test. And so, it was our duty to explain that to them. But, if we hadn't, it would be good for the candidates to have asked us what the steps were. So just make sure you're very clear about what the room, timeline, and are there any other expectations for me as a candidate. And this day and age, emails are fine, but we'll get the business cards of the people you've met with and just send short notes. And try to make them as personalized as possible. We used to crack up at the consulate. We got the same email cut and paste from the same candidate with just our name replaced. You can personalize it just a bit. Really nice to meet you. It was very interesting to hear about your role as the postdoc office director versus dear Chelsea, the director of our BEST program. I really enjoyed hearing about your program. It can be subtle, but just try to make them differentiated if you can. Let in the chat window asked if it was okay to ask for feedback if you don't get the job. It's totally okay. Just don't have open-ended. Don't have the expectation that they will give you feedback. And I would say that, preferably ask for feedback via email. Don't put someone off guard on the phone. That's probably not, yeah. Question, if you know this will be a multi-step interview, should you send a thank you after each step or wait until the end? I still think it's a nice courtesy to send, a thank you after each step, especially because most of the time in a multi-step interview, you probably won't meet with the same people each time. A phone interview, it's often an HR recruiter. Interview, it's usually the people that are most relevant to your day-to-day in that position. So in general, when possible, I would say, you can still send an interview at each step. And again, it also provides an opportunity to demonstrate that you're still interested in the job and reiterate that kind of one-sentence sales pitch. In terms of group thank you emails, it's fine. But I cluster it. So again, if you were interviewed by a panel of 3, then just if you met with multiple panels throughout the day, or you met with some people individually, you met with some people as a group, I think in that setting you could email the panel that you met with as one group. What I wouldn't do is if, BU for this job, for example, I ended up meeting over 2 days with 12 people. If I had sent one thank you email to all 12 of them, I think that would have felt pretty generic. But there were times where I met with people one-on-one, and there were times when I met with people in a group, and I could have, I think, very easily sent an email to groups and say, dear, the 3 of you that work on this project, thank you so much for meeting with me. Totally reasonable. This is my wrap-up slide. I hope you learned about social presence and the types of interviews and questions that you might get. Hopefully you were able to jot some ideas down related to the STAR method. But really going forward, I just want you to be able to identify that there are strategies that you can proactively use to create connections with your interviewer, even in situations where you might feel nervous. And that, there are different types of questions that people ask you to get at different facets of your qualifications. And just know that, there is this pretty simple framework that you can apply to make sure that you answer questions efficiently. So with that, we still have 9 minutes of time on the clock. I'm happy to stay here in the chat room and take questions that you guys might have about interviewing generally or my experience interviewing other people. But like I said, I'd really like to thank Julie and Amy and Andrew and the rest of the NPA team for inviting me to be a part of this webinar and for organizing the series in the first place. And I hope that you guys have had a good experience today. Yeah, thank you. And like I said at the top, I'll put again here. But email, of course, don't hesitate to follow up. And like I said, I'll send those questions to Amy, and she can hopefully get them out to all of you. for more about the STAR method. I think if you Google STAR method, you will find kind of more than you could ever want to know. Like I said, I didn't invent that. It's probably in every interview seminar. In some ways, I feel almost generic for including it, but I guess it's been so critical to my own success. Like, I'm a framework type of person. I really like to have a kind of clear process, and so in some sense, that's why I love it so much, because it's just really easy for me to break down my answer and make sure I'm covering everything. So I don't have a specific favorite resource, but like I said, I would say if you Google STAR method, this is a very kind of widespread framework. Talked about it kind of in the way that I think about it, but I'm sure other people have different ways of thinking about it too. Yeah, in terms of the slides, I'm happy to share them, and I think this was recorded today, and so that means the slides will be part of that recording too. So. Oh, very helpful. Get the book showed. Did I show book? I don't remember. All right. Yeah, to you. About the questions, I'll just send that out. So here at BU, we have a kind of interview guide for managers like me to be able to ask questions, and so I'll just give that to Amy, and we can include that as part of the webinar package. Or Starbucks or something. No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. Oh, question. Sure enough. Formulating her question. Another one has come in terms of how important are the thank you notes. I mean, I guess this is a personal thing. I touch to kind of keep keep you on their radar again and to serve as a reminder, and it's a polite thing. I will say it doesn't make or break. If I don't get a thank you note from someone, it's not like I cross them off my list and think, well, they're totally impolite, I won't hire them. So it's definitely not a deal breaker by any means. I guess what I would say about it is that if two candidates were exactly entirely equal in every single way, on paper and in person, where I just literally tossed and turned and it was going to come down to a coin flip. Before I flip the coin, I might think, well, one of them sent me a thank you note, and that demonstrates they're interested in the position. But I think that's incredibly unlikely. It's far more likely that people are pretty equal on paper but distinguish themselves in person. Olga's asked, recruiter, what is your take on LinkedIn and its role in the hiring process? I mean, I have to say that that's where I, as a manager, let HR do that for me. So the way that it works at BU is that as a manager, I have a choice. I can see all of the applications, or I can let HR do an initial filter. And the way that I approach that is that I actually let them do the initial filter first and see how many candidates come out of that stack. And if I feel like I don't have a strong enough field to bring people in for interview, I'll look at the stack that they might have reviewed and decided not to bring in. And so they definitely use LinkedIn to look at people's profiles. I don't know this for certain, but I know based on the recruiting statistics that some recruiters also look at things like Facebook and Twitter when they can. Social media can play a role, but I myself as a manager, I don't know, I just sort of don't have time for that. Maybe some other managers do though, so I guess it's just where LinkedIn can be helpful, I feel, is more in the pre-of networking, setting up informational interviews. And if you're on the job market, it's always good just to make sure that it matches your CV or resume and that all of the information is there. But yeah, maybe it's also just my general aversion to social media. I don't personally engage in LinkedIn that much, and so it's not a big tool for me. I'm sure in other places and in other settings it is. So I think it's something definitely to be conscious of, and I think what you're hearing in my advice is kind of my own personal approach to recruiting, which varies. We've got those margarita post, pictures on Facebook. You want to consider making those private. All right, thank you so much. Do feel free to follow up with me. And like I said, I'm glad to see that some of you, got things out of it. I hope you had fun today, and as much fun as we can have in about me being able to see you in person. And I wish you a productive rest of your week. So thanks.